My friends, the Ukrainian counter-offensive has officially started. And let's just say that round 1 was a complete disaster.
Emotional damage!
For those that missed it, here's how it went. I'm sure you have many questions. How many vehicles did Ukraine lose? How many casualties? How much ground was gained? This week, Ukraine attacked in 2 sectors. Attack number 1. 2 Ukrainian brigades were repelled in the Velika Novosilka sector on the east side of the Zaporozhye front. Very shocking, I know. Who would have thought that they would attack there? The only place Ukraine can really attack is the sector between Uliaipole and Velika Novosilka. Want to know how it went? Just take a look at it yourself. This is not what we call probing attacks. 42 recorded losses just in that part of the front. And at one point there was this Russian drone recording these Max Pros turning in circle while they were reenacting Colonel Armstrong at Little Big Horn, with the same end result. 4 MRAPs destroyed here, and another 3 here, and many more left and right. To be honest, I'm disappointed. We talked so much about NATO training. I just expected the Ukraine to have better tactical skills. And as we're speaking, there is attack number 2, a much more serious one, as it involved heavier armored equipment, where Ukrainians are attacking out of the town of Orehiv towards Tokmak, the most fortified sector of the Russian line. Very shocking as well. My guess is that the Ukrainian general staff planned to use the towns of Orehiv, Uliaipole and Velika Novosilka for the final stage of the offensive. Unlike the MRAP attack near Velika Novosilka, on the Orehiv front, we have the first video evidence of German-made Leopard 2s being used in combat. And we also got the confirmation of the first destroyed Leopard 2 by the Russian army. More on that next video. I watch video and wait for the next video and History Legends will say, I told you. I told you. Are we gonna get articles like these ones anytime soon? Anyway, since the attack on Orehiv is still taking place, so I'll focus on the Ukrainian attack in the Velika Novosilka sector. However, the analysis should be valid for both these offensives. Spoilers, they sent a couple battalions of cannon fodder forward, meant to assess Russian defenses. Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukrainian war. Remember that if you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, just like with many other commentators, some of my Ukraine videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my PayPal or Patreon to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. At the beginning of the week, the Ukrainian army launched multiple attacks against the Vremyevsky salient, that is a semicircle formed by the towns of Novodarivka, Rivnopil, Neskuchne, and lastly Novodonetsk. However, the most important thing is that the main Russian line of defense is 17 kilometers away from the line of contact. A perfect example of defense in depth. The salient was said to be defended by the Russian 127th Division, which benefited from a central position from where they could send reinforcements to critical sectors in a timely manner. And this will prove decisive in this battle. In early June, there were many reports of mine-clearing operations by the Ukrainians all over the Zaporozhye front, a clear sign that an offensive was on the way anytime. On June 4th, Ukraine attacked with 6 mechanized and 2 armored battalions of the 23rd and 31st Mechanized Brigades on multiple sectors of the salient. One group pushed towards Novopil and captured the village. They continued 5 kilometers and took hold of Novodarivka. From there, some of their advanced detachments continued their progression for another 6.5 kilometers onto the hamlets of Levadne and Priutne. Group 2 attacked in parallel of Group 1. They captured Novosilka and was then tasked to capture Rivnopil. Meanwhile, a third group pushed out from Velika Novosilka towards Neskuchne. Although at first glance it might seem like a simple reconnaissance enforced mission, we can clearly see that their objective was to reach the main Russian line of defense in Orlinske via 3 parallel axes of attack along the Mokry Yali River, from where the elite heavy brigades would then smash Russian fortifications. This is where the Ukrainian plan went, According to the Russian MOD on day 1, the losses of the Ukrainian armed forces amounted to 250 personnel, and a total of 40 vehicles destroyed or abandoned, among which 16 tanks. Now I think to understand what truly happened, we have to look at where those casualties took place. As you can see on the map, there are 4 areas where Ukrainians lost the bulk of their vehicles, what we can call tank graveyards. And as you can see, these 4 main areas of destruction all follow the axis of attack we just spoke moments earlier. So this helps us to understand from which direction they attacked. One of the largest disasters took place in Novodarivka, right here on the map. In this footage, you can see the first vehicle of the column, a US-made Max Pro, and then it gets hit by a mine. We can clearly see the explosion come from below. And on the bottom right corner, we see a Ukrainian Soviet-era tank. And according to this video, there are 2 groups of Ukrainian vehicles approaching this tree line. And here's the aftermath. Honestly, I'm still shocked. I don't know exactly what happened, but they all rushed towards that opening. In this single frame, I can count at least 9 destroyed or abandoned vehicles, 2 tanks, plus 7 MRAPs, plus 2 or 3 more losses around. Personally, I think the same happened to them to what happened to the Russians in Vuhledar. At first, they got targeted by Russian artillery, as we can witness by the many shell craters around their position. And they all rushed to safety without knowing that they were all rushing towards a minefield. What was surprising to me is that I didn't see any mine rolling equipment on these vehicles. I don't know what they were thinking. Perhaps they expected the MRAPs, the mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, to actually survive going through a minefield. This is not Afghanistan with homemade IEDs. And notice how Russian drones can easily fly over Ukrainian columns, most likely to guide artillery fire. Where was Ukrainian electronic warfare? Where was the air cover? We can also assume that in all these tree lines, there were some Russian observers hidden that guided anti-tank fire from the ground, supported by mobile anti-tank crews mounted on ATVs that could fire on enemy vehicles almost at point blank. Now, what was the Ukrainian strategy? Each of these Max Pro MRAPs can transport roughly a fire team of 5 to 6 riflemen, plus the driver. So in this footage, we see 10 MRAPs, that would mean 50 men. Now what I think happened is that since the Ukrainians don't have enough vehicles, they would send multiple waves of 40 to 60 infantry from point A to point B. Once the riflemen are disembarked in an area with proper cover, the MRAPs go back to the rally points and drive another batch of troops forward. However, notice how we don't have any footage of infantrymen, only vehicles. Either they were destroyed in the vehicles, so you can imagine the casualties, or the Russians could have been a bit sadistic by letting the Ukrainians disembark multiple groups of riflemen before smashing the MRAPs and then annihilating the isolated infantry with artillery and tanks. Another such steel graveyard took place in Rivnopil. This column you can see here was essentially annihilated. Once again, all grouped up in one area. I counted 8 Max Pro MRAPs destroyed or abandoned plus 1 tank. And that's something I noticed with all the Ukrainian armored attacks on the Zaporozhye front. All the columns are made of 1 tank and roughly 10 armored vehicles. Like I said in my previous video, the biggest problem the Ukrainians have right now is that they don't have enough tanks. Now notice that first Max Pro in front of the column. It is equipped with a minesweeper. Of all the footage I have analyzed, it's the only one where I see some mine rolling equipment. And all the vehicles of the column advance back to back, within each other's tracks along the tree line, following that first vehicle with the mining equipment. Now here's the very creepy part. Check out this combat footage from this Russian Ka-52 Alligator. They were literally stalking this column we just spoke about and fired at each vehicle one after another. This is what happens when you launch an offensive without air cover. Or rather when your air defense gets destroyed before the offensive. Even NATO bots are shocked by the tactics used by the Ukrainian army. Moving into open flat terrain with tanks with no air support is suicide. Honestly, there's a lot more footage from helicopters, I just haven't been able to geolocate it. But we can clearly see it was a turkey shoot. Many isolated Ukrainian vehicles were destroyed. It It was also reported that Russian tactical aviation played a key role in fending off Ukrainian attacks. In 3 days, they reportedly destroyed 5 enemy tanks and 29 armored vehicles using a total of 50 anti-tank guided missiles. And cherry on top, the Russians also made heavy use of FPV drones, like this one crashing into one of the 2 Humvees. The last major disaster occurred west of Neskuchny and Starozheve. It's the video I showed you in the introduction of these Max Pros driving in circles. If you know what they were trying to do, let me know in the comment section below. Anyway, here's the final outcome. 4 abandoned MRAPs, here's another one, boom, here's another threesome that ended up quite messy. 2 other Max Pros and even a tank. Seems to be the same scenario over and over. Platoon-sized units aboard 9 to 10 MRAPs plus a tank getting ambushed. Just by looking at the equipment that was used, this is only round 1. I don't think Ukrainians will stop there. Here's another thing that I thought was interesting. The reports mentioned that it was the 23rd and 31st Mechanized Brigades that led the attack. Those are relatively new formations. They barely have any experience coordinating offensive operations. And according to Military Land, both these brigades only started training in mid-February. Now, as for their equipment, check out some of the pictures they posted on Facebook. We can see a Max Pro MRAP and a fire team following closely behind. Essentially what was used during these attacks. Now, looking through these pictures, I had a weird feeling that a lot of the battalions of these 2 brigades were actually filled with conscripts and territorial defense units. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But you can't tell me that those guys were the same ones that went through NATO training across Europe. They all look very brave to me, but it's typical Ukrainian territorial defense units. And want to know what's very sketchy? According to this deployment map, there was the 108th and 128th Territorial Defense Brigades in the sector of Velika Novosilka. So it's very possible that the 31st Mechanized Brigade, for example, is simply an upgraded Territorial Defense Brigade, essentially a TDB2S+. Now, if that's true, that changes the entire understanding of what happened. The Ukrainian General Staff essentially sent cannon fodder units as first wave to take all the hits, to probe enemy defenses, to push through minefields, while they kept their elite formations to the rear, the ones meant for the real attack, that are grouped in what the Russians call the Maroon Tactical Group, composed of the 46th Brigade, 82nd Airborne Brigade, 71st Jaeger, and the 132nd Recon Battalion, located somewhere in that area we covered last time. Anyway, talking about this makes me very sad and disappointed that we still have to resort to these tactics. Back to the battle. The next day, on June 5th, at 4 AM, the Ukrainians continued the offensive, and we almost got a rare tank engagement. Red Effect made a very good analysis of this, so I'll just summarize it. Here you can see 2 Ukrainian T-64s. The one on the left seems to be abandoned, while the other one is slowly approaching the tree line. On the other side of the woods, there are 2 incoming Russian tanks. Now, we all expected an epic tank battle, almost at point blank. But nope. It appears that some Ukrainian infantrymen that were hiding in that tree line fired their anti-tank weapons and destroyed one of the 2 tanks. And that's about it. Although the Ukrainians made significant gains on day 1, the Ukrainian attack was stopped by units of the 127th Russian Division that immediately counterattacked and recaptured the villages of Novodarivka and Neskuchny. And here's something noteworthy. The Russians restored the integrity of their line ASAP, unlike their previous defensive behavior in Kherson or lastly in Bakhmut, where they allowed the Ukrainian forces to keep their gains. However, what you have to remember from this is that if the Russians reconquer the lost ground, that also means that the Ukrainians won't be able to recover all the vehicles that they have lost. Another thing that kind of went under the radar, there are more and more reports of Russian divisions. That's because after the failure of the BTGs and the subsequent failure of brigades, the Russian army reconstructed their entire force along divisions, just like in Soviet times, as they considered them to be the only units to be strong enough to effectively defend and attack on their own. They have their own reserves, they have their own tanks, they have their own artillery, they have their own air defense. They're highly autonomous formations. And this is a direct effect of the Russian mobilization that allowed the Russians to beef up all their existing formations. While the Ukrainians understood that their attacks on the west side of the river all failed, during the night of June 4th to the 5th, the Ukrainians used the cover of some forests to launch a surprise attack with over 20 armored vehicles along the Shaitenka River. Essentially a company worth of troops, 100 men. Although they were spotted by aerial reconnaissance, there were not enough Russian units in that sector to intercept them. There were also reports that the Ukrainians used electronic warfare to crush Russian communications, and the Ukrainian column managed to cross over the Shaitenka River. Meanwhile, to beef up their attack, the Ukrainian command called up a couple detachments of the NATO-trained 37th Marine Brigade, as well as the elite 68th Mountain Jaeger Brigade, to consolidate their latest gains. Together they pushed 5 kilometers towards the Oktobyar State Farm and captured the village of Novodonetsk by 6 p.m. The next step was to reach the Mokry Yeli River and essentially flank Russian positions. So we do see that the Ukrainian command is very reactive. They won't try to send column after column in the same sectors. They will try to move around. So that's a good thing. Now, we don't have many details on what happened in that sector, but we do know that their casualties were mounting. In this video, you can see a British-made Mastiff MRAP of the NATO-trained 37th Marine Brigade being destroyed by a mine. However, because of their proper training, instead of continuing forward, the remaining 6 vehicles halt all movements. In the end, the crew survived and was evacuated, and the Russians were later able to take photos next to the disabled vehicle. For example, here we have footage evidence of 3 abandoned French AMX-10 RC light tanks. That's enormous if we take into account that the only unit equipped with those is the 37th Brigade, and they only have 14 units. Here you can see another photo of the same 2 abandoned French wheeled tanks that took part in the attack on Novodonetsk. This is also where we got the first reports of supposedly destroyed German-made Leopard 2s. Although they can look very similar from the top, it's very easy to get them confused. But the Russian Ministry of Defense was so excited to announce this that they simply reported having destroyed 8 Leopard 2s. But perhaps because they're a little bit short-sighted. If they back up too much, every target can become a Leopard 2. And on top of that, this Ka-52 helicopter confused some farming equipment with German-made main battle tanks. Take that, Green Deal! At nighttime and over the course of June 6, Russian forces of the 127th Division counterattacked all along the front. They regained control over Novodonetsk and essentially brought back the line of contact almost where it was on day 1, apart from this bridgehead west of Novodonetsk. Now check out what these Ukrainian soldiers had to say about fighting in that sector of Novodonetsk.
Там ни одного врага мы не видели, никого. Просто обстреливали минометами. 5 часов нас дроны снимали. Нас с нашей стороны, нашей поддержки не было. Нас не обстреляли, никто минометом не... Ничего. Нас просто кинули туда для того, чтобы, я не знаю что. Для чем? Сообщили о том, что мы не отказываемся воевать. Мы отказываемся воевать под начальством нашего батальона, поскольку они по-нашему просто нас кинули на смерть.
In the end, with barely any gains worth mentioning for Ukraine, the biggest problem is the high casualties they suffered. The Russian Ministry of Defense claims that in just 3 days of hostilities in all directions, the armed forces of Ukraine lost up to 3,700 personnel and over 300 vehicles, including all the farming equipment, However, to be honest, I didn't see 300 Ukrainian vehicles being destroyed, and same thing for the casualties. Even if we're talking about 1/3 of that number, those 2 brigades essentially lost 25% of their strength within 3 days. In the end, a lot of the Russian success in this defensive battle is attributed to Russian General Mikhail Teplinsky, as he was in charge of all the units from Vuhledar all the way to the Dnieper. There's a lot of news coming up every hour. I'm working overtime for you. This is all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The link is in the description below.